On today's Locked On Giants podcast, it's all about the New York Giants defense, key players, top questions, stats, and a whole lot more coming your way next.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, credentialed member of the New York Giants media for Locked On, as well as for New York Giants on SI, which is where you can find all of my written work. And as always, we welcome on in our Blue Crew community members, our everydayers, our newcomers, and everybody in between. Thank you for spending part of your day with us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. And today's episode of Locked On Giants is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com today to get started. All right, Giant fans. Now, as promised, today we're going to look at the Giants defense. Now, if you saw yesterday's show, I went through a variety of different statistical categories, questions, battles, basically an overall preview of the New York Giants offense. So I'm going to follow the same formula today, but obviously it's going to be all about the defense. So we're going to get right into it because we've got a lot to cover. And just following the roadmap, we're going to start with indispensables. Then we'll do top questions. We'll talk about stats. We'll talk about who's on the hot seat. We'll talk about battles to watch, and then I'll have a bold prediction for you. All right, now let's get into the indispensable players. I have three. You could probably guess who number one is on the list. So let's just get it out of the way. Dexter Lawrence is the most indispensable player on the defense for the Giants. And it goes without saying, Dexter is an every down player, pass rusher, run stopper. When he's off the field, you notice it. And not just because, of his boisterous nature, of his, enthusiasm that he brings, but you notice it because opponents generally go right to that hole that Dexter Lawrence would have otherwise been in. So he gets number one on our list. Now, I'm going to reverse it here, and I'm going to go 3 and 2, since those are probably toss-ups for you. The third most indispensable player on my rankings is Bobby Okereke, inside linebacker. Now, last year, Bobby Okereke did have some struggles. He got off to a very slow start in that new defensive scheme that Shane Bowen brought in. There were times that Bobby Okereke looked lost, wasn't quite sure what to do. But you know what? Before the end of his season, which was cut short due to a back injury, Bobby Okereke started to look like the Bobby Okereke of 2023, and that he was logging more tackles. I think he had two of his last 4 games. He had double-digit tackles. He was getting guys lined up as he usually does. He was making plays, chasing down ball carriers. Basically, he was looking like the 2023 version that we saw that led the team in tackles and just was so indispensable and would have ranked higher if we were doing this a year ago, coming off of that season. So Bobby Okereke is number 3 on the list. Number 2 for me is outside linebacker Brian Burns. Now, just, based on what I know to be true right now, I think Brian Burns is probably the most lethal of the Giants' 3 outside linebacker pass rushers, all right? Kayvon Thibodeau and Abdul Carter being the other 2. That is subject to change. I get that. But just based on what we know today, like I said, I think Brian Burns is the most lethal. I think Brian Burns is going to be the one who probably gets double teamed a lot more than Carter and Thibodeau, at least to start the season. And, I think he's also, as I will kind of reveal a little later on, a little spoiler alert, I think he's going to lead the team in sacks this year. So I got to give this one to Brian Burns. Just, a really tough guy. He played through some devastating injuries last year. I don't know how he did it, but he donned that Spider-Man persona that he holds so dear, and he went out there and he did his thing. So Brian Burns, ranks second on my list. So again, to recap, Bobby O is number 3, Brian Burns number 2, and Dexter Lawrence number 1 in my indispensable Giants defender list. All right, let's go to questions now. Top questions. Question number 1 is, can Shane Bowen, well, not can, but how can Shane Bowen get Kayvon Thibodeau, Brian Burns, and Abdul Carter on the field at the same time? There are ways he can do it. The question is how is he going to do it? Is he going to have Carter do some inside linebacker work? Is he going to have him be a spy? Is he going to, you know, come up with some kind of funky alignment that we haven't seen? We might get some answers starting with the OTAs, which start next week. So that's something certainly I'll be keeping an eye on. But, that's going to be key because, look, in the beginning, some people feel, and I kind of feel this as well, that maybe Carter will take some of the snaps from Burns and from Thibodeau. But ultimately, you're going to see the 3 of them get on the field at the same time. It's just a matter of what packages they're used and how they're deployed. But that's a top question. I think that's something that a lot of people, myself included, want to see what the answer is for that. All right, the next question, actually the next 2 questions on my list basically have to do with the same position unit. Is Deonte Banks going to bounce back from last year? Deonte Banks, this is kind of interesting. Deonte Banks, I looked this up, and the theory, the theory that he doesn't have a whole lot of experience with zone coverage, that's not really true. He has played zone coverage. Now, he's better in man press coverage. Last year, when he was asked to play zone, he struggled in Shane Bowen's system. I don't know exactly what the difference was. I'm going to see if I can't find that out, if there was a difference versus what, he did the year before for Wink Martindale. But Deonte Banks last year, all too often, when you saw him struggle, his confidence took a hit. And when he lost his confidence, he basically kind of threw up his hands and just kind of did what he could to survive out there, which wasn't good enough. So the Giants changed coaches. They brought in Marquand Manuel to replace Jerome Henderson. And the hope is that Manuel, who like Henderson, used to be an NFL defensive back, that he can get more out of Deonte Banks. And, they better get more out of Deonte Banks because pretty soon they got to make a decision whether or not to pick up his 5th-year option. I think that decision comes next year. So that's something that they better, figure out the answer to. All right. Now, sticking with the defensive secondary question that I have, and this is a big one as far as I'm concerned, is do they have enough depth in the defensive secondary? Cornerback depth to me, actually, let me back up a little bit. They have the numbers, but do they have the quality? All right. So if there is an injury to one of the starting cornerbacks on the outside, who steps in? You're going to run with Cordell Flott? You're going to run with Trey Hawkins? You're going to run with somebody else, right? So there's still some question marks there for me as to who they run with on the outside, at the outside cornerback. Same question for the safeties, all right? You've got Tyler Newman and Javon Holland, who are going to be your starters. Then you have Dane Belton, who really hasn't quite developed into the starter that I think they were hoping he'd turn into. Then who else do you have that you can really sit there and say, oh, no problem if he has to go in there and play? So I'm a little, squeamish about the depth of the defensive secondary. I don't know that they have enough. Now, of course, in training camp, maybe somebody steps up and shows that, and answers this question. I certainly hope that's the case, but that's the one position that I think, or the one position group, I should say, that I think is just, still kind of on shaky ground as far as I'm concerned. All right, coming up next, we're going to look at stats that need to change and who is on the hot seat. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Hey, Giant fans, the NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't miss moments. Whether it's a game winning shot or a breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action. FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip off and live. So, do you think the Knicks can bounce back from their Eastern Conference Finals Game 1 choke job the other night? Who's going to lead the charge? Explore this and more player props, performance trends, and same game parlays where you can win big. Head on over to fanduel.com today. And if you're new, sign up. It's a perfect time to sign up because when you place your first $5 bet, if that bet wins, you will get $200 in bonus bets. So go on, make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to Locked On Giants. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, and it's all about the defense today. So again, if you're tuning into the podcast at this point in it, make sure you check out yesterday's podcast. I did the same format, answered the same questions about the offense. And I know a lot of you wrote in and said that you really enjoyed that episode. So I hope you're enjoying this one as well as we close out yet another week, a quiet week in terms of football stuff. Next week is when everything gets kind of busy and picks up a little bit. On Tuesday, the Giants start OTAs. No media access on Tuesday, but there will be media access on Wednesday. I plan on being at the OTA for Wednesday. And of course, I will bring you everything you need to know about what goes on at the OTA. So make sure you keep it here on the Locked On Giants podcast, as we will still be 5 days a week next week. All right, let's get back to today's program. We are now up to stats that need to change for the Giants defense. And I have a few here, actually. Obviously, the run defense is probably number one. That's got to be number one. The Giants finished 27th last year overall in run defense, giving up an average of 136.2 yards per game. All right. They've got to be better, especially if they're going to rely more on that two-man defensive front with Dexter Lawrence, and it's to be determined. So they've got to be better at that. That goes without saying. They're facing some good running games. They've got Saquon Barkley, old friend, twice this year as usual. The Giants got to be better at the run defense. It's that simple. Okay, obviously points per game. The Giants last year gave up 24.4 points per game, which was the 12th most in the NFL. You'd like to see the offense score at least 24.4 points per game because that'll put them closer to that magic number of 25, which seems to be what the playoff bound teams average the last few years. So 25 is the kind of the magic number for the offense, but not so much for the defense. You know, you kind of want to see the offense and defense for the Giants flip the numbers that they had last year. And that would, that would be really nice. It would mean more wins, obviously. All right, another stat that needs to improve, interceptions. All right, last year, according to NFL media stats, the Giants had a 0.99 interception rate, which was 31st in the league. Now, I don't have to tell you, you get interceptions, you get turnovers, you get them in ideal spots, and you give your offense a shorter field with which to work. It helps, right? All too often, and I've looked for this stat, I haven't quite found it. So I think what I'm going to do, this coming year is I'm going to just track it myself. But I do know there were several instances where the Giants defense, they dropped interceptions, and you can't have that. All right. So hopefully that isn't the case this year. They've got to be better at that. All right. This one, I kind of wish I had put this in yesterday's show too, but I'm going to throw the stat out for you because just as a reference for you. But pre-snap penalties. Now, the Giants on defense, they actually tied for sixth most in this category, but the number really isn't too high. If you think about it, they had 10 pre-snap penalties, all right, neutral zone infractions or whatever, what have you. So that was tied for sixth most amongst NFL defenses. Now, for those of you who are curious about the offense and how many pre-snap penalties they had, 40, tied for fourth most in the NFL last year. All right. That according to NFLpenalties.com, if you want to check out their pretty good stats on NFL penalties. All right. So that's a stat that definitely has to be addressed. Pre-snap penalties. I get all right. On defense, you don't really know the snap count, but you have to have discipline. And I dare say that last year the discipline on the Giants, both sides of the ball for that matter, was lacking a little bit. And it showed up in the pre-snap penalty category. All right, I'll give you one more stat that I think needs to improve, and that's pass yards per attempt. All right, the Giants allowed 6.5 yards per pass attempt, tied for 8th most in the league. You'd like to think that the revamped defensive secondary is going to help, but, how quickly is that defensive going to come together, So that to me is a big question mark. We've talked about question marks before, but remember, this Giants defense in the offseason, it got a lot of love. All right. It got a lot of new players and new faces. And it's going to take time for the unit to come together and gel. And it's kind of interesting. I don't know if you guys saw it or not, but Lawrence Taylor, the great LT, was a guest at the Giants facility this week. And he got to address the Giants defense. And he basically said, look, when I was playing, I knew what every one of my teammates on the field, what their job was. And that helped to make me a better player. And, you want to do the same. You want to play together as a unit. You want to operate as one. It was a pretty good message. I wrote about it actually on New York Giants on SI if you want to check that article out. But so yeah, too often last year, you had members of the Giants defense that weren't doing their jobs. They were worried about doing somebody else's job. And at the end of the day, if everybody does what they're supposed to, chances are you're going to have a pretty successful day. And we just didn't see enough of that. So, I mentioned the defensive secondary and also, how good are they going to come together? But really, you can apply that whole notion to the entire defense because you do have a lot of new faces on there, unlike the offense, which really, the only new face of note is at quarterback. So those are some of the stats that I would like to see change and improve for next year. All right, now let's go to the hot seat category. And I actually have a lot of the guys on the hot seat, to be honest with you, are all coming from the same position group. We'll get to that in a moment. But number one on the hot seat, cornerback Deonte Banks. All right, I mentioned that come next offseason, Joe Shane's going to have to make a decision on Banks' 50-year option. Based on what we've seen so far, I don't think you pick it up. Now, if he has a good year and he bounces back and he shows that he can function and contribute and be effective in this defensive scheme of Shane Bowen's, then you say, okay, you've redeemed yourself, we'll pick up your option. But right now, based on the first 2 years, I don't think they do it. All right. So that being said, Deonte Banks is number one on my hot seat. Now, the other three guys that I put on the list all play on the same unit, and they're all defensive linemen where there is loads of competition. So I'm going to start off with Jordan Riley, who in the past was pretty much the backup nose tackle. Now, Darius Alexander's coming in, the 3rd-round pick for the New York Giants. Darius Alexander, although technically he's better, as the 3 or a 5 tech, Darius Alexander can go in there and he can play nose if you need him to. You don't want to play him at nose all the time, but if you need him to spell Dexter Lawrence for a play or two, he could do that. So I see him as a potential threat, if you will, to Jordan Riley's position on the roster. The same can be said for DJ Davidson, also a draft pick for the Giants. All right. Again, Darius Alexander, that's a kid you're going to keep an eye on because I think it's just a matter of time before he's starting next to Dexter Lawrence. And like I said, he can potentially spell Dexter Lawrence if he needs a breather. Again, you don't want to see him doing it every day, every down. You don't want to, God forbid Dexter Lawrence can't play. You don't want to necessarily see Darius Alexander do it for the entire, an entire game, but he is an option if you need a spot reliever there. And then last but not least on the hot seat is Nacho, Joaquin Nunez Roches. He's in the final year of his contract. Quite honestly, if I'm being honest with you, I'm surprised he's still on the roster. I really thought he was going to be a cap cut. And, he wasn't. He's still on the roster. He's going to get a chance to compete. But the Giants, they've added, Roy Robertson Harris, Jeremiah Ledbetter. They've added a bunch of guys, veterans and young guys. And, look, I'm glad that they improved the depth of the defensive line. We saw what the Eagles were able to do in the Super Bowl with a deep defensive line rotation, but they're not going to be able to carry all those guys. Somebody's going to not end up making the 53. I question if Nacho is going to be, on this roster coming in September. I really do. I just don't see it, but that's why you go out and that's why you compete and go through OTAs and training camp and the preseason. So we'll have to see how it all shakes out, but this is just, preliminary, evaluation. So, all right, coming up next, we've got our final two categories. We've got the battle to watch and we've got bold predictions. So don't go anywhere. I'll have that for you right after this. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, and it's all about the Giants defense today. Again, if you are tuning in to the podcast at this point, if you did not check out yesterday's program, which was all about the offense, this is kind of the same idea. And a lot of you liked it, so I figured let's do it again. Well, we had to do it again anyway. I don't have plans just yet to do special teams. I may do that on Monday. Haven't quite decided, but I can tell you next week I'm going to preview the OTAs. So that's coming up. I may have a guest for you next week. So plenty more to come here on Locked On Giants. All right, let's get to these last two categories here. The battle to watch, kind of the obvious here, folks. It's going to be on that defensive line. I spoke about it in the last segment. So many newcomers to this defensive line. And how is that depth going to shake out? Dexter Lawrence, he's locked in as a starter. That we can all agree on. Is Darius Alexander going to be ready to step in as a starter? Or will it be Roy Robertson Harris that will be starting next to Dexter? Or will it be somebody else? Will Elijah Chapman, who made the roster last year as an undrafted free agent, as a tryout candidate, really, will he be on the roster? Who's gonna stay and who's gonna go? A lot of competition on that defensive line. So I, for one, am interested to see how that plays out because, look, it starts up front in the trenches. And I think we could all agree after seeing last year that the Giants got pushed around a little too often in the trenches. And whoever they do keep on the roster, whoever they do start on that defensive line, or whoever they decide to play as much in the rotation, that defensive front better be better. And I think it will. It's just a matter of, okay, who brings what to the table and how are they deployed? Now, I've said before that in Andre Patterson and Brian Cox, the Giants have two of the best defensive line coaches, in my opinion, at any rate, in the NFL. So I'm very much interested in seeing how Patterson and Cox get those guys working, who steps in, who has what role, and how they're deployed and what kind of production they're able to generate, not just in training camp, but also in the preseason, which will be telling as to who might make the roster and who won't. All right. Bold predictions. It's time for some bold predictions. Now, I really just have one here, but it's got multiple parts. And what I mean by that is I'm going to give you a total stat, a group stat, and I'm going to break it down for you how I think it's going to shake out. And the stat that I've chosen is sacks. I think the Giants will register at least 40 sacks, but I do not think that any one pass rusher will hit double-digit sacks. All right. So I have Brian Burns being the sack leader with 8.5. I've got Thibodeau with 6.5, and I've got Carter with 6.5. Now, I do think that Brian Burns will lead the team in sacks. All right. I just think, it's interesting. I suspect he's going to get doubled a lot, but if you get Dexter Lawrence up front and you have Dexter and you've got, another big body next to him, whether it be Darius Alexander or whoever, I think that's going to free things up for Brian Burns and Thibodeau and Carter. I just suspect that Burns is going to lead the team in sacks. I don't know why I have that feeling. Again, I could see him being chipped a lot. I could see him maybe being doubled a lot, but Burns there's just something relentless about his pass rush, a little bit more edgy, if you will, than I think that of Thibodeau's. That's not to say that Thibodeau doesn't have a good pass rush, but I just think Burns plays the pass rush with a little bit more of an edge. And as far as Carter goes, 6.5 sacks, not too bad for his first year. I'd like to, is it going to be more? That would be great if it's going to be more. And I do think in time he's going to be, maybe take more of the snaps on. Like I said in the beginning, I think Carter might in the beginning spell Burns and Thibodeau. But if you're going to spell one of those guys, I just suspect that maybe you're going to see more of a rotation with Carter and Thibodeau than you are with Carter and Burns, if that makes sense. So that's kind of why I think Burns is going to end up as the sack leader for the Giants. So we'll see if my prediction comes through. I'm just using logic and reasoning, so we'll see if it comes true. All right, Giant fans, that is going to do it for this edition of the Locked On Giants podcast. Now, I want to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. And for your second listen, please go and check out the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast. As training camps get closer and moves are being made, your hosts, Kyle Krabs, Joe Marino, will make you the most informed NFL fan this offseason. So go on, find Locked On NFL Scouting on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. All right, Giant fans, that's going to do it for me. I'll be back next week with all new episodes. Have a great weekend. If you're traveling, be safe. Enjoy Memorial Day weekend. And we'll see you again next week.